Exploring business ethics practice in top firms in Peru, typology, density, and links is a presentation prepared by Mario Pasco, Levy del Aguila, and Milos, professors of the Department of Management Sciences at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru for the 21st International Conference on Knowledge, Culture, and Change in Organizations. Business organizations have an increasing influence on all spheres of human activity. Therefore, there is a growing concern for their ethical behavior regarding their internal and external stakeholders. Most studies have focused on describing ethical practices in business organizations and measuring their impacts, often addressing only certain groups of firms. Few of them have systematically examined the variety and depth of ethical practices in a large sample of companies. There are some national studies in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, United States, and Australia. In Latin America, and in Peru in particular, this lack of knowledge is paradoxical, considering that this region has endemic problems of corruption and requires precise diagnostics on the extent to which companies have been incorporating an ethical approach. Business ethics involves a systematic and methodical approach based on a certain normative framework to the moral behavior of people within organizations and in their relationships with their stakeholders regarding dilemmatic situations in the complex business world. The theoretical and empirical literature on firms' ethical behavior has distinguished 6 groups of practices. A large number of companies have elaborated on internal instruments, such as ethical codes and statements, so as to establish the normative framework that guides internal and external relationships. Many firms have also adhered to external standards, often developed by specialized international organizations such as the ISO certifications and the Sustainable Development Goals. Another common practice in a growing number of firms is the constitution of ethics offices, either ethics committees or compliance offices. The implementation of ethics programs, either internally or externally guided, is another recurrent practice. Multiple companies have also introduced schemes of reporting so as to communicate the ethical approach and practices to a larger audience. Lastly, multiple business organizations have established control mechanisms so as to supervise the performance on ethical issues. The purpose of this research was to analyze the typology, density, and connections between the ethical practices applied in the most important companies in the country. The study was based on the structured observation of ethical practices reported on the websites of a probabilistic sample of 365 companies out of the top 10,000 in Peru. The analysis of data involved the construction of a comprehensive index, which represents how many different groups of ethical practices are applied in a given company, and the weighted depth index, which represents the sum of specific practices applied by a given company compared with the best performer on that practice and weighted considering the complexity of their implementation according to an experts panel. These indexes were also correlated with the firm's size and sector.
The most reported group of ethical practices are internal instruments, mainly ethical policies, and external standards, mainly international certifications. However, less than 1 out of 4 companies reported any of the other practices. On average, companies have less than one of the practices examined, although this range may substantially vary. For instance, some companies have designed up to 17 different ethical policies and have other up to 9 general frameworks. A possible explanation in the case of internal instruments is that they are the least complex practice to implement, especially when their design is merely declarative. With regards to certifications, they are a far more complex practice to apply, though often it responds more to an external pressure, such as customers and governmental requirements, than to an internal commitment to ethical issues. In order to analyze the consistency in the implementation of an ethical approach in the companies, each of the 13 different ethical practices were correlated to each other. The correlations were measured using the chi-square test with 10 or 5% of significance levels. The resulting matrix provides a comprehensive perspective about the way in which companies apply the variety of ethical practices. The cross-correlations matrix offers several valuable insights. To begin with, when companies apply ethical practices, they often do so consistently. This means that in many cases, these practices are jointly applied. For ethical practices, ethics codes, general frameworks, training programs, and ethical hotlines are highly consistent with all other practices. In other words, once these practices have been introduced in the company, the incorporation of the others' specific practices is foreseeable. For instance, the design of an ethics code probably involves the constitution of an office in charge of implementing it through the corresponding process of training, reporting, and monitoring. In the same vein, the subscription of an external ethical framework often presupposes the consolidation of an internal ethical program. Interestingly, ethics policies shows the weakest connections with the other practices. A possible reason is that an important number of companies may be developing these policies as initiatives of functional areas, such as human resources, legal advice, and community relations, but not as a result of a more systematic ethical approach. The practice referred to other offices is probably disconnected from other practices because it reflects situations in which the ethical function is performed by another functional area and not a specialized one.
The comprehensive index measures how many different groups of practices has a given company with a maximum of 6. The average index was 2.1 out of maximum of 6. This means that the companies of the sample only applied 2 of the 6 groups of practices analyzed, mostly internal instrument and external standards. This result confirms that the majority of firms do not incorporate an ethical perspective in a systematic way. In turn, the weighted depth index measures not only the variety of the ethical practices but also the relative performance of the company in a given practices of the complexity and of its implementation. The average index was 6.1 out of the maximum of 34.6. This average is also relatively low considering that the hypothetical maximum indices would be 59.2. Although larger firms would be expected to perform better in both indices than smaller ones, considering that they have a more strategic approach, more resources, and more exposures of social monitoring, the test applies did not show significant differences. A similar comparison of both ethic indexes was made considering the economic sector to which companies belong. In this case, the weighted depth index reveals some significant variations. The firms in the extractive sector seem to have a higher index, probably due to the recurrent criticism and external pressure that experience these companies. Something similar occurs with the service sector. It is important to indicate that the social surveillance that might be triggering this ethical approach comes from different sources, to with environmental agencies and local communities in the extractive sector and the customer organization in the service sector. Finally, some conclusion and implication. This research provides the first systemic approach to the typology, density, and connection between ethical practices in the top companies in Peru. The information revealed that, with the exception of ethical policies and international certification, a minority of companies shows a systemic incorporation of the variety of practices examined. In addition, there are some important differences in the ethical performance of the companies, considering the industries to which they belong, especially regarding extractive and service firms. Two implications of the study are the need of a more articulate approach to business ethics within the companies and the pertinence of designing public policies aimed at stimulating such a comprehensive approach, as it produces positive effects for the companies and their multiple stakeholders. Lastly, future studies could generate more precise inference about the ethical performance of the companies by including a larger set of organizational variables, including ownership structure, geographic coverage, number of workers, and relevant sectoral regulation.